Hello and hello and welcome to Expat Chat. I'm John Colditz with Fluency Corp. If you're not familiar with us, we have about 200 coaches around the world that help business professionals improve from conversational fluency to business proficiency in their second language, so they can communicate clearly and confidently with colleagues and clients. We're happy to share these firsthand expat experiences with you. And if you're joining us live, please let us know where you're joining us from in the chat. Today, I'm joined with Amy Kraushaar, founder of Expacity. Give her some love in the chat and be sure to ask any questions you'd like her to answer. Welcome, Amy. Tell us a little bit about you.
Hi, John. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on the show. I really am excited to be here and hear what questions people have and what questions you have. Um, I am a 22-year expat living in Portugal. I live in Lisbon, Portugal. And as you said, I run a business that helps inform people moving to Portugal on all kinds of things that they need and want to learn before they move here and then after they arrive and they're getting settled in, and all the information that comes, not from me, because I'm not an expert on anything except living in Portugal, but all the information comes from professionals who do webinars for us, like lawyers and accountants and um, real estate agents and mortgage brokers and financial people and tax people and all those sorts of things. So they help everyone get informed, learn what they need to know, help them make better decisions as they're in the moving process and then when they arrive. So that's
Great.
what we do. I call it kind of the Netflix of moving to Portugal because everything's in the every time we do a webinar. I do one every week. It's so much fun to be on this side of the camera. It's pretty fun. And all the stuff that we record every week, we put into a big library that members get access to. So right now there's over 300 webinars in there. So it is kind of like Netflix that you say, what I want to watch tonight, what I want to learn, and it's all there.
Great, great. Well, hey, so tell me a little bit about when did you first move to Portugal?
Oh gosh. Well, the first time I actually came to Portugal was on a holiday in 1997, I think it was. And
Okay.
then I moved here in 2002, when it was a completely different place than it is today. You've probably seen stuff about Portugal in the news. It's become a very popular place for people to move to start a new life adventure. It's very friendly to expats. It's a beautiful place, great food, great wine, all that kind of stuff. But when I came here, there was still great food and great wine, but there just weren't very many expats. It was pretty small community, so it was just very, very different.
Okay. Had you lived anywhere internationally before Portugal?
I didn't. I had lived mostly. I'm from Iowa. I spent most of my adult life in Chicago. I came here, and then after I came to Portugal, I actually took a job in London, and I think maybe we might talk about that later. But I took a job in London that had me living in Spain for a while, living in more sort of concentrated periods in and around um, Eastern Europe, Central Europe. But at that point, I was living in the UK, so that I was kind of living between Portugal and the UK. So those have been my experiences as an expat, and and they're all extraordinarily different from each other. So I think that's when I learned how how to be an expat was by learning those different places.
So Iowa, Chicago, that alone is a little bit different than UK and Portugal.
Yeah.
Um, s- uh, what's your favorite part? So, what's your favorite part about uh, any of those locations? What comes to mind? What do you cherish from each location?
Well, I think you said the most important thing when I grew up in Iowa and how very different it is from Chicago. I used to say that when I would go visit my family in Iowa from Chicago, I would take my passport when I crossed the border because Iowa had very different culture, different food, different language than living in Chicago. But Iowa is a great place to grow up. I loved I really loved being a kid in Iowa. It was just so free, and you could kind of ride your bike everywhere, and you could never have to worry about much in terms of it was just a great growing up thing. Then I moved to Chicago after university, and I love Chicago because it's a huge city, but it's not. I've lived in New York for a little while as well, for about 2 years. And the comparison between the two of those, again, completely different. Chicago is very, um, it's a Midwest city, so it's very open, and the architecture is fantastic. You still have all the culture and the food and the outdoor stuff of Lake Michigan there, but you have winter, which I'm not a fan of. And it's still, what I love about Chicago is you can get almost any place in the world from Chicago, from O'Hare. So that was really where my travel bug kind of bit me the most, and I started doing a lot of personal travel when I was in Chicago. And
So did you
then
do a lot of international travel then?
I did. I did. My very first international trip was, believe it or not, to Turkey. So
Okay.
not very standard. I think my cousin was living in Ankara, and I decided that I would go visit her. So that was pretty extreme in terms of going from the United States, from Chicago to Turkey. We went to Ankara. We took the train to Istanbul. Completely different. I didn't understand anything anyone was saying. Everything was complete. I think I'd been to a Turkish restaurant, and that was about the extent of my knowledge about Turkey. But I learned a lot about it while I was there. And then I spent time going to, where other places I went. I did a bike tour in Mali in West Africa, where we had to pack our own stuff and pump our own water, and we didn't have a sag wagon or any of that kind of stuff. It was a very small group run by a guy who was in the Peace Corps in Africa. That was really cool. Of course, I went to Paris. I went to Germany. I went to, I'm trying to think, just all sorts. Obviously, I've been to Canada, to Montreal. I've been to Mexico. I've been to a lot of different countries, but moving, when I was in Chicago, I decided to go to Portugal because I was a complete travel reader. So I would go to the bookstore, because we still had books back then, and look at the bookshelves and buy everything, every travel narrative. And my goal was always, if I could find a place where there wasn't a book written about it, then that's where I wanted to go. And Portugal was one of those places. When we first went there in 1997, there was no book on the bookshelf that had Portugal in it. And so I said, okay, I want to go. I want to see what it's like. And again, really different. I still remember driving out from Lisbon out towards Spain through the Alentejo. And on the radio, you could turn the stations back and forth between Spain and Portugal. And the language is completely different to the ear. Portugal sounds like Russian. Most people, when they hear it for the first time, say it sounds like Russian. And obviously the food, the architecture, the history, everything is completely different. But I fell in love with Portugal that first time that I went there.
Wow. And so had you already been to so let's back up a step. You moved early in your career to Chicago, and then where does UK fit in your timeline?
So I actually moved to Portugal in 2002, and I went back and forth between the United States and Portugal for a while as I was working. I was working for myself. And so I started being a digital nomad before it was actually a thing. It's really funny. I think I was a beta test for all the different things that people now use all the time. When Skype, I was on Skype when it was when it launched. Some people in the audience might remember AOL chat. I
Mhm.
used that to chat with people in other countries, and my Portuguese boyfriend, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Um, so so basically, I moved to uh, well. So I was in Chicago. I went there in, as I said, in 1997 for holiday. Completely fell in love with it, loved it, and then I was actually getting divorced from my American husband. And I decided to go back to Portugal and see if it was as cool as I remembered it, because I wanted to buy a little apartment and fly back and forth from Chicago to Lisbon all the time. Even though, again, did I do my homework? Did I find out how that works? No, I did not. I just took the plunge. And on that trip, I met this Portuguese guy who became my husband.
Wow.
Started out to be my boyfriend, of course, but became my husband. And on that trip was when I really fell in love with Portugal. Um, and then I moved there in 2002 to be with him. And then, as I was doing all of that, I decided to look for work over on that side of the pond. And that's when I took a position in London.
Okay.
But I was still technically living in Portugal as a resident, and was working in London, but traveling all the time for my job.
That's fascinating. So, and I want to talk more about the early stage digital nomad experience, or are we getting ahead of ourselves?
No, that's that's the right way to think about it. I had this dream that I would be able to work anywhere on the planet, in Portugal, and my clients would never know that where I was. So I would schedule meet while I was living in Portugal. I had clients in the U.S. And I would schedule meetings. I would never tell them I would be on Skype. They wouldn't know, because you would have at that time you would have a U.S. phone number or that sort of thing. It's funny, I don't use Skype anymore. I use stuff like this all the time, so I kind of forget how Skype works. But then I would fly back to the States to do a project, might be a 6-8 week project, and I would fly back to Portugal and do something fun for a while, and then get another project and fly back to the States. Um, it was, I had a laptop, and the kind of work I did was strategy and brand, marketing, strategic marketing, that sort of stuff. So I didn't need a big team. I didn't have to be in a bunch of different places. I would just mostly be at my clients. But over time, I did tell my clients that I was actually living in Portugal, and of course, they were amazed. They just couldn't believe that someone could do that, because this
Yeah.
was in the early 2000s, and people just weren't doing that kind of thing then. So I'm trying to think. There were other things like, um, but there was some technology wasn't caught up to all this stuff yet. We didn't have all the apps. We didn't have. I had for a while. I had two phones before they had dual SIM card phones,
Okay.
and I would have one for the U.S. and one for Portugal. Yeah, there was a lot of crazy things that we had
Right.
to do.
Yeah, I did a similar thing, but that's been probably 8 years ago now, and the process was so much easier.
Yeah.
And still, no one in the U.S. knew that I was working from London,
Yeah.
and we actually bounced around a bit, but still, as far as anyone knew, I was calling them from my office in Texas.
And I don't know about you, but I didn't tell my clients at first, because I was concerned that they would think it was really strange. So it was kind of a secret. Unlike now, when people are like, oh, yeah, I'm calling you from Barbados or
Yeah.
wherever. And people go, oh, how's the weather there? And it's all very normal and natural. Back then, it was not. I remember when I told my clients that I was actually living in London or Portugal or something, they were amazed, but they were also perplexed. Like they didn't really understand why someone would want to do that. But I guess I was just an early adventurer in terms of doing that sort of thing. And for me, it seemed perfectly fine to be able to do that.
And you mentioned you had that. So when you were still back looking through bookshelves of travel books, what sparked that interest? Was that something that was always there, or was there something that
I think that's a really good question. I think that came from living in Iowa. I mean, I went to university still in a state school in Iowa. I wanted to go other places. I wanted to go to other schools, but for various and sundry reasons, I went to a state school, and I just, I think it was. Oh, I remember. I was telling this before. When I was in university, I was studying liberal arts and journalism. And so one of my courses I had to take was a language course. And I decided to go with my journalism that I would take Russian.
Okay.
Because I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. And so I figured Russian would be the best thing possible. It would probably get me the furthest away from Iowa. Little did I know that Russian was really difficult. So I took Russian for 2 semesters. Then I switched to French because it was just too difficult. I do remember a couple of words in Russian. My favorite one is morozhenoye, which is ice cream, which isn't going to help me really with any kind of journalistic.
But it is fun.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, it was, excuse me, that's my dog barking. I have 2 dogs. But yeah, I mean, so it was that idea of wanting to be a foreign correspondent, wanting to travel, and then just reading about all the different travel narratives and the humor and everything that people encountered. It just seemed like something I wanted to do.
So it sounds like that there was something innate that travel, and I've been to Iowa. It's not a horrible place that you just got to get out of. But at the same time, it's in the middle of the country. There's not a lot of diversity back in 2000 to really keep it interesting for someone who's got that inclination.
Yeah, and it's funny because most of my family doesn't travel at all. So yeah, it's definitely something genetic or just a quirk of mine. But and you bring up a really good point, because it was one of the things of moving to Portugal where I have sort of reddish hair and blue eyes, and when I moved to Portugal, I didn't see anyone that looked like me, and I would walk down the street and the people would do this. And that was really unique, because where I grew up in Iowa, everyone looked like me. And most people were blonde. I have freckles and pale skin. And so it was really interesting to be in Portugal and have people know just by looking at you. You didn't have to open your mouth or anything, and they'd be like, you're a foreigner. And that, of course, is not something that I think most Americans experience living in the United States. So
yeah, it's I would encourage anyone to intentionally put themselves in a position where they're the ones who are not from around here.
Absolutely. Here's my theory. I think everyone on the planet should have to go live 3 months in another country on their own without a company transferring them or something, because 6 months would be better. But 3 months is enough time to give you the sense of everything is different. I still remember when it really hit me in Portugal. I'd been there seeing this Portuguese boyfriend. I decided to move there and see if I wanted to. I decided to go there and see if I wanted to move there. So that was the plan. And so we got an apartment and we chipped in equally to furnish it. And I had a 9 months kind of a timeline that I was on. And I think it was the second day that I was there, and I went into the kitchen, and on the faucets were marked Q and F, and I thought, what have I done? I don't even know what this is, what these mean, because I didn't know at the time that F is frio, cold, and Q is quente, for hot. And so, of course, the faucets wouldn't be called H and C, which they would be in the United States. And I remember that it's just a I mean, it's so powerful. I still remember, I'm getting goosebumps. I still remember how crazy that was. I thought, what have I done?
Mhm.
I don't speak the language. I don't know what's going on. But I was already there. So, and I'd made a commitment to doing it. So it was bumpy, but fun at the same time. And obviously, it was fun enough that I stayed. So
That's some great insights. Yeah, I know when I worked in Italy the first time, just starting to take Italian, and we're over there, and I just figured out which door was men's and women's, and
yeah,
then went to Sicily and tossed it all over again.
yep.
But
Yeah, it's crazy. I
but
mean, I
but
could go into so much
because
language
in our
differences.
industry, we do so much specifically to help people be comfortable getting into those situations. Uh,
Yeah, it was it was so interesting that um, you know, I would still I would go to parties with my then husband, and I was lucky that so many Portuguese speak English, and especially the younger people. And my husband was 9 years younger than me, so all of his friends, they spoke pretty much enough English. But still, when you go to a party or a social situation, they're all speaking Portuguese. So there was a lot. I learned to be a good listener, and I would start to figure things out. I did take lessons, and I had private tutor and those sorts of things. My Portuguese still isn't very good. It's okay. I wish I was fluent. Someday I will just devote myself to
we can help
taking.
with that.
I know. To me, that's like Here's the other thing that I think is really interesting about the language, and this is a tip I always give to people that I work with. Learning the language is a humongous insight into the culture of the country. So it's one thing to be able to order off a menu or say hello or know what's being said, but how the language works and the colloquialisms, but even how the language is structured tells you a lot about the culture itself. There's Portuguese has formal and informal.
Mhm.
But what many people don't know, depending upon the teacher that you get, is after the revolution that happened in Portugal in 1974, using the formal version was kind of a no-no because it came across as classist. So
Okay.
instead of using "vous", which is similar in French, which would be the formal version of you would either use tu, which still seemed a little bit informal, or in Portuguese, you can actually drop those words entirely and you can just use the verb to speak if you conjugate it correctly. But it was very interesting to learn from my teacher, from my husband, from people around me that no, you didn't. If you used "você", it would sort of communicate that you were looking down on someone that you were talking to.
Okay.
Um, but that's not true in other countries where they have the formal and informal version. So
Right.
it's a unique thing to Portugal. But and once you open up that, then you start learning about the revolution and what happened, and all the different things that you just learn through the language itself. I just think you can't get when you're reading a book about the culture. You
Oh,
have
yeah.
to learn it when you're learning the language.
Yeah. You learn so much about how people think in a given country. And so,
Absolutely.
if I'm sure if you went to Brazil, it would be completely different because of that. I know just trying to count in French drove me crazy because it's like, Roman numerals or something.
Yeah.
But it did give me a lot of insights into working in the country and working with the people.
Yeah.
Just how they process things like that.
Yeah, and my name there's no Y and there's no K in the Portuguese alphabet. So I had to learn to spell my name using the Latin letters because that they would know, because there's no Y and there's no K on the keyboard either, on the Portuguese keyboard. So I would have to figure out how to do the toggle to find the letter in there. But so my name is Y Kappa, and to me that was another like shocking thing that I was like, wait, my name doesn't really shouldn't exist in Portugal.
I just don't translate here.
Yeah, and Portugal still has a list of names that I think it's changed slightly, so I may be speaking not exactly truthfully here, but until very recently, there was a list of names that you could only name your children those things. They were Portuguese names. So unlike, what's her name, Gwyneth Paltrow, who named your kid Apple, you couldn't do that in Portugal. That's why there's a million Nunus and Maria Joaos and Pedros. And because everyone has the same first name, that's why nicknames are really, really common here. And they get smushed together and rearranged. And believe me, I don't know how they know when they go to school which Pedro is which Pedro. Oh, and the other thing is Portuguese have multiple names because they add all their parents' names onto them.
Okay.
So when you go to school, your class list, I learned this because I started to take school there as my PhD. And I found out that my name was at the top of the list of the class. And I was like, well, because they're all listed by first name. Because they can't list you by surname because some people have 4 surnames and some people have 3 and some people have... And so you have to list Ana, Maria, Pedro. And so they do it by the front versus by the back, which again is a very different cultural thing. And I'm sure that there's a lot more that shows up in that. I'm so sorry about my dog. I'm so sorry. I don't want to yell at him. He does this when he's stressing another dog is walking by. I'm so sorry about this. Hang on, I'm going to mute myself for a second. Sorry, he's very upset.
Yeah, in the last 3 years, how it's changed where, in 2019, that would just stop a meeting in its tracks. And now
it's common. I know. Thank you for being patient. I have 2 dogs, actually. It's a good thing the other one doesn't really bark. So, and they're both Portuguese dogs. So I guess we'll just have they're adopted from here. So
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. So we were talking about language and names and all, but I just really can't stress enough. I mean, it's one of the first jobs that I was offered here, and I didn't take it, and it's my only regret about moving to Portugal is I was offered a job at the Portuguese office of Jones Lang LaSalle, headquarters in Chicago, real estate, shoulda, coulda, woulda. And I said no because I was going to be the marketing person and for the Spanish and Portuguese office, and everything was done in the language of the country. And I spoke neither of those. And they told me, "Don't worry, you'll catch on." And I if I would have taken the job, I would be fluent now for sure.
Yeah.
But it was too scary, and they weren't going to offer different classes, Portuguese classes or Spanish classes, because they're quite expensive. They were quite expensive at the time. They're not now because there's so many tourists and foreigners here. The price of classes has gone down considerably. But at the time, it was extraordinarily expensive, so the company wasn't going to pay for it. And I was thinking about this the other day because I thought, man, if I had taken that job, my whole life would be different. I would be so fluent. Lord knows what I would be doing, but
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't have started Expacity. But yeah, I just think it's just so critical, even though so many countries speak English these days. The language of the day-to-day work environment is the language of the country. And I worked in a Portuguese company for a while, and they all spoke English. I was the salesperson for the Northern European countries, so I was speaking in English all the time. But all my colleagues were speaking Portuguese to each other across the desk and during lunch and in meetings. So again, I listened, so I know Portuguese well by listening, but not as much by speaking. I wish I did.
So were they? Did they welcome you in other ways?
Yes, absolutely. There was, I was the only foreigner in the company. It was a small company, a tech company of about 50 people. But a lot of the work was for clients outside of Portugal. Almost all the work was. So the CEO had a joke that he that he said when they hired me that I was the one who was in charge of putting together the meetings for all the Northern European clients. So the Scandinavian clients, Germany, the UK, Ireland, Austria, Switzerland. And and he said that it was really important that I was there because that meant that the meetings would start on time. Because Portugal has a much slower, relaxed culture, which personally I like a lot, even though I came from the US being pretty much triple type A. I like the pace here. And I like the fact that the relationships are the drivers of everything, not transaction based and not money based like it is in the US.
Okay.
It makes the work culture much friendly. Well, I mean, the U.S. culture is very friendly in the workplace as well. And I also have to recognize that because I was the only foreigner, there probably was a lot of times where that was sometimes uncomfortable. But at the same time, it was, being in that position was not a bad thing because it also gave me the opportunity to share what I knew in different ways, to offer different things. So again, no, just like being, looked at when you walk down the street. Sometimes you are in a fishbowl when you're a foreigner in a work environment as well. But depending upon how many other foreigners there, sometimes it can be a really fantastic thing. When I worked in London, it was a melting pot. So the office was in London, but all the employees were from all over around the world. So that was actually a fun in a different way because we could all say, oh, in Hungary we do it this way, and in Spain we do it this way, and in Turkey we do it this way. And it was something where you were always then collaborating and figuring out, well, what was the way you were going to do it there and how could you make it different? And that was a fantastic thing about that work environment.
So your experience in London, where it's very multicultural, and Portugal, where it's mostly
monoculture.
Okay.
Mostly.
How did that affect your initial reactions, culture shock, things like that?
Ooh. I think I had more culture shock, greater culture shock when I moved from Lisbon to London than when I moved from Chicago to Lisbon. That's because I expected living in London to be very similar to living in New York. And it completely wasn't. Even though I spoke English, well, American English fluently, British English is not only a completely different language, but culturally and behaviorally a very, very different place. And this was one of the besides the language, the culturally, the behavioral, the space bubble. This was something I remember really well. Is that in the UK, your space bubble is almost bigger than in the US. So
Okay.
no one touches each other, and if your shopping bag touches somebody else's shopping bag, it's like, oh, sorry, because it's like you just don't do that. In Portugal, I think it's again a small country, a densely populated country along the coast, and when you're standing in the grocery line and someone's touching you, my inclination as American is to move forward so they're not touching me. And what would happen is they would just move with you and just because they were oblivious, they were talking to their family member or neighbor or somebody
Mhm.
behind, and they would just keep moving up. And so there was a complete discomfort. Often in Portugal, walking on the sidewalks, everyone walks very close to each other. And in the UK, again, completely different. But the, in Lisbon, things in some ways were much more contemporary than they were in London. London's shops at that time when I was there, the shops still closed at 4 o'clock on Sundays.
Okay.
So if you wanted to go buy groceries on late Sunday afternoon, you basically couldn't. I found that out the hard way when I arrived and I wanted to go stock my kitchen, and I went to the grocery store, a huge grocery, Sainsbury's, huge store, on a Sunday afternoon. It was closed, which was extraordinarily shocking to me. And in Lisbon, all the big hypermarkets are open till midnight, on holidays, weekends. They're completely different in that sense.
I
And
find, in current times, it's when I'm in a different country, I kind of expect that. It's when I'm in a situation where I don't expect that. So, you know, trying to go to a deli in New York on Yom Kippur. If you're not
true,
Jewish, you know, how did I
doesn't
know?
happen.
You know? But
Yeah.
try to get a bagel on Yom Kippur. It's not going to happen in New York.
Yeah, well, it's true. And like this is another thing about Portugal. Portugal does not, they don't respond, as I said before, it's relationship based. Email is something that people just generally don't use, even in business. It's there, they have it, they generally don't use it. Phone conversations are much preferred. And if you don't speak the language, you can cheat by email, and you cannot cheat so well by phone because you don't have the visual to go with you.
Right.
So I was going to go run an errand at a place on Friday, and Facebook didn't seem to say they were open. Everything was there. I had the hours and everything, and I drove 30 minutes there. When I got there, there was a paper sign on the door. It was clearly closed, and it said, "We're out from this for a month on holiday, on vacation. Come when we." And so the store was completely closed for a month, and there was nothing on their Facebook page. There was nothing on their website.
Was it the time when, so in a lot of countries, August, everything shuts down and people expect that?
Exactly. I was not expecting that from April 24th to May 24th, but
Okay.
this is a kind of business where they need to be open in August. So they were taking their holiday.
Okay.
Probably everyone Portuguese who goes there all the time knows it, because that's the other thing about Portugal is most people live very near to where they grew up.
It's
My
the things that
Portuguese,
don't have to be explained in the local context that are the hardest, because
yep,
how do you explain something that doesn't need to be explained? You may not have vocabulary around that. And those were the things that seemed to be challenging the most when it was a cross-cultural experience.
yes. And this
And
is what I
what you said,
tell. Go ahead.
that's
Sorry.
what when, a lot of the people that we coach, that we train, are actually pretty fluent, but phone calls, so we talk about going from conversational fluency to business fluency. Those things, when you can't cheat, are the things that we really focus on with
Yep.
business people. Yeah.
Yeah, and all the business slang that's used
Yeah.
in every and Portugal has a lot of sayings that people use commonly in everyday language, just like any country does. We do. You and I are speaking American English, and we can talk all of our euphemisms and sports analogies and whatever crazy things we say. And I, especially when I worked in London, I had to not be very conscious of not using those. Run something up the flagpole. Let's see. Let's take this to bat. And what I can't even think of all those things, and I don't really use them anymore because nobody would understand what I was saying. So and that was interesting to learn the Portuguese business conversation as well, because they use completely different silly phrases to have the same sort of conversation. So
the first time somebody in London said, "You're in my diary," I kind of creeped me out.
yeah. That's there was a lot of those in London for sure. In the UK, I can't even. We went to a pub quiz once where it was all the questions. They had mixed teams, and they were about different words between American English and British English. So that was
Okay.
pretty funny. And Portugal generally speaks British English. So that is where it actually came in handy, because most of their teachers were either Portuguese educated in the UK, or the British and Portugal have a long history. So people who speak English here, still more older, but younger ones speak more English with an American accent, but older ones speak British English with all those words.
So do you work with people that come from Brazil or other Portuguese-speaking countries with different dialects?
I do. And it's interesting because you had Deborah Dahab on not too long ago, and she is someone I engage with Expacity. She's done a number of webinars for us. She's Brazilian, although you wouldn't know it by hearing her speak English, because she has an American English. I've never heard a word and any kind of accent other than American. But when she starts speaking Portuguese, like, we'll go out and have a coffee and we'll order and whatever. And that's when I go, because the Brazilian Portuguese is it's very different to the Portuguese. To me, it's like what we hear is English between British, Australian, New Zealand, American. We hear those distinctions. But as a non-native Portuguese speaker, it took me a long time to hear the differences between Brazilian Portuguese and continental Portuguese.
Okay.
Only when they would say hello, because the Brazilians say bom dia and Portuguese say bom dia. And then it's a very similar. Brazilian Portuguese is softer. It's more mushed together. It's a little slurrier. Whereas Portuguese from the continent is more distinct. It's more, it's very specific in terms of how the language is used, more formal. So it's, once you learn it, then you can tell. But when you're first learning Portuguese, you can't tell the difference one from the other. Just like I've had Portuguese people ask me if I'm British. And I think, what? But they don't hear the distinction between an American English and British English unless they're listening to it all the time.
Okay. So go ahead. Were you going to say something else?
No, I just said to me, it's interesting because, of course, I think, how could you think I'm British? Although I did have people in the UK tell me I walked like an American. I still don't know what that means.
That's I'm not sure how I'd respond to that.
I don't know. Purposefully, forcefully, fast? I don't know. Don't know.
So you've been in country now. You've been in Portugal for what, 20 years now?
22. Yeah.
22. Do you consider yourself immigrant, expat? How would you qualify that?
I'm an immigrant. That's how I always saw myself, because I knew I was coming here forever. I have Portuguese citizenship that I got in 2008. And I always came here with the intention of coming. I mean, excluding the first 9 months where I had this Portuguese boyfriend, and we did get married. We subsequently got divorced. But it was 10 years, 10 fantastic years. And I got to keep my citizenship, which I got through marriage. And I will, unless something radical happens, I can't imagine leaving Portugal. Now, what's interesting, another thing about the culture is even though I am Portuguese by nationality and I have a citizen card and a passport and everything, the Portuguese, most of them will admit to you that you're not considered Portuguese unless you're born here. So that would include even the ex-colonies and stuff. It's like, yeah, you're Portuguese, but not really. So even if I was fluent, the fact that I'm not born in Portugal, there's a very strong emotional connection to the country, which is quite different than the U.S., where once you get your citizenship, then you're American, everyone's American. So it's quite different.
So how frustrating is that?
It is. Because I have a citizen card here. I have it right here with me. That is like this is my national ID card. And it used to be that anyone who had a temporary residency that just had the visa and a temporary residency didn't have a plastic. This is a plastic like a credit card and has all my data and everything on it. The temporary citizens had a different looking card. Now they have one that looks very similar to this.
Okay.
So what's interesting is because I look like I do, because my name is what it is, even when I pull out my card, people will still ask for, when did you move here? Or they assume I'm a temporary resident.
Okay.
So I have to then go out of my way. Sometimes I carry my Portuguese passport with me just for emphasis. But then I have to be a little careful because then they will expect me to be fluent in Portuguese. That would be the expectation. And since I'm not so great, I can get along mostly, but then I get stumped.
Okay.
And so then I get, that would be the thing. But looking how I look, I could be Brazilian, but still, again, I think there's something in my demeanor or maybe my behavior or something that says I'm clearly not Portuguese. It's those really subtle things.
So do people still look at you? Do they still consider you American?
No, they don't know. I mean, like I tend to have lots of conversations with Bolt and Uber drivers and that sort of thing. And we talk about things and they generally don't know. They know I'm a foreigner, but they don't necessarily know where I'm from unless I tell them. So
does that decrease the assumptions? Like, do you think there would be more assumptions about you when people know where you're from versus people that aren't quite sure?
Good question. I don't know. I've never really asked them. It's when I first moved here, there were so few Americans that meeting somebody who was American who said they were living here would generally bring the comment, why did you move to our, and then they would say a not so nice word. I'll use the word cruddy country, because there was, again, the country was very different back then. So they would be really flabbergasted that an American would move to Portugal when America was supposed to be this dream place of Hollywood. And
so they're being self-depreciating.
Yeah.
Okay.
But now I think there still are very few Americans here in the sum total. There's about 700,000 foreign residents in Portugal. And of that, there's maybe at a high point about 10,000 Americans. But there's been a lot in the media about Americans moving in droves to Portugal, even though there's a lot of visiting. There's a lot of American tourists here for sure.
Yeah.
So I remember the first time when I was walking down the street in about 2015, and I walking down the street in Lisbon, and I did a double take because I heard an American accent speaking English. Several people, a gaggle of people, tourists or something. That was probably 2014 or 2015. So it was surprising enough for me to notice. Now it's just you hear American English everywhere, probably more so than British. At least in my part of the country, in the Algarve, you'll have a lot more Brits living there. But it's, I don't know what the feeling is that people, Portuguese they still like Americans, like many countries. I think they like Americans. They may sometimes not have as great feelings about America, perhaps based on politics and history and that sort of thing. But in general, I think Portuguese, they don't have any, I guess I'll say it this way. I don't think they have any bad feelings about Americans, although there is a perception that of wealth, but that's reasonable considering that Portugal is still one of the poorest countries in Europe. Or I shouldn't say the poorest, the wages are, I think, second to Greece in terms of being the lowest in Portugal. So anyone who comes with any kind of money, the average salary in Lisbon, which is a big city, is 1,100, 1,200 euros a month. And that's tough when the average one bedroom rents now for about 1,500 a month in Lisbon.
Wow.
So it's changed a lot with the real estate.
How do people do that if rent is more than what your gross income is?
Portuguese live with family, or they I don't want to get on my soapbox about this because I'm Portuguese and I don't pay that for rent because I can't pay that for rent either. But they live further out. One of the good things, I guess, because of COVID, a lot of people work from home. Obviously, we don't have COVID anymore, and Portugal had 98% vaccination rate or something. Very much everyone works for the collective and the common good. But with people being able to work from home, that helps a little bit. But those who can't afford, just like in New York, young people live at home, or they live a lot of people to one apartment, and they share. A lot of people rent a bedroom. It's very common in New York for young working people, and these are all, by the way, highly college educated people as well, because it's one of the problems in Portugal that all the college educated young people can't find well-paid jobs here, and they are educated and speak several languages usually, so they leave the country for better career prospects. And that's why Portugal then wants to encourage immigrants to come. It's a very common historical problem for Portugal. We have a lot of waves of immigrants leaving and coming based on economy and history. So, but yeah. So I think in some ways, it's really challenging for people living in Lisbon, for sure. For Portuguese people, but not just for Portuguese people, even the people that are moving here, it's just changed a lot. But those things are hopefully changing soon because the government is looking at new laws to help ease up the housing crisis that's been going on, which is a global phenomenon, by the way. It's not just Portugal. So they're working on it to see what they can do to help even things out. So
that's good. So yeah. Hi, Jason. Jason Hall is checking in from U.S. Law. And if you that's a good segue, because I'm sure Jason may have some thoughts on the legalities of moving. But are there any particular suggestions as you wrap up if someone's thinking of moving to Portugal? What what would you suggest to someone who might be thinking about that?
Well, of course, I expect that they would join Expacity because that is one of the things that we can provide is a lot of research and information, education on those things. But I think really, truly aside, all of that sort of aside, I think if you are American, not that they're the only people, as I said before, it's a small group of people moving to Portugal. But if you're American and you're going to be working, definitely you want to do some tax strategy and tax planning. Be sure to look at that. Portugal has some really great programs to help defray taxes and income over 10 years NHR program. But it's really important that you kind of get those, I'm going to need ducks in a row with that American slang phrase. I think also it's really important for anyone moving to Portugal to consider where they want to live and perhaps not living in Lisbon or Porto or even Coimbra, which are the three major cities. There's so much beauty in Portugal. There's so much cool stuff, more affordable housing, great culture, fabulous food, great wine, friendly people. When you're looking at other places within Portugal, all the little towns and villages just outside of the big cities, there's great public transportation. There's bus systems and trains that go all over the country. So you don't have to live in one of the big cities to have a great experience living in Portugal. So that's probably one of the most things I would say. Don't be afraid of moving further afield because in some ways you'll get a much more interesting, in my opinion, Portugal experience than if you're in one of the big cities where people will just look at you and speak to you in English and you won't get a chance to practice your Portuguese at all. And you might be surrounded a lot by tourists. So I really would encourage. Is
there a certain level of fear for if an American is going to feel uncomfortable if you move further out from the major metropolitan areas where you can practice your Portuguese, but if you're not really comfortable with your level of fluency yet, how would you address the fear of taking that step?
It definitely. So I totally understand that because remember, I came here not speaking one word of Portuguese, even though I had a boyfriend. He went to work and I was on my own. What is great is, so, like it said, the young people, anyone sort of 40 and under, has had English in school. They've grown up with English music, culture, movies, all that kind of thing, books, obviously online. So if you get concerned, find a young person and they will be very shy. They will tell you their English isn't very good. And then they will shock you because, of course, their English is actually pretty darn good. And they will always be willing to help you. Older people, even though they don't speak English so much, they might speak French. But more importantly, they will meet you 3/4 of the way. There's always a way to communicate. Pictures, gestures. It's just, it sounds daunting. I get it. I've been there. But if you just relax, have a beer, have a glass of wine, you will find yourself much more relaxed and you will be surprised at how well you'll be able to communicate with people until you get your Portuguese up to speed. People are just so happy that when you say bom dia, boa tarde, obrigada, which is thank you, they're happy that you do that and they'll help you come the rest of the way. So it's more important that you find the people who you can practice with, because if there's people around who speak English, they will speak English to you and help you out. So you won't be able to practice as much as you'd like.
Well, thank you again, Amy. We're getting up to the top of the hour. Appreciate all your comments. Is there any final pieces of advice that we didn't cover?
I don't think so. I think it's I just think what your company does is fantastic because like I just can't emphasize enough that you learn the culture when you learn the language, and that is something that is just so I don't just so cool because you start to figure out what makes things tick, what makes people tick, and then you can start to feel much more comfortable and at home in a place because then you kind of like, oh, I know what's going on. I know how this works. And that culture shock will go away. It always comes back every now and then, but it will be much less stress, I think.
So the moral is baby steps.
Baby steps, and it's totally fine.
Right. Well, hey, again, thank you, Amy. Appreciate what you do. Appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to share with us. And for those that are watching this, hope to see you at a future Expat Chat. And if you'd like to join us, feel free to reach out to me, and would be happy to have you. So for all of those joining us live, we'll see you soon. And thanks again.
Thanks so much, John. It's been great. Thanks for having me.